today's World Insight, Biden finishes his first press conference. Is there any indication that China-U.S. ties are on the mend? And China-U.S. relations in a tailspin. Can they sink any lower or on track for recovery? A Yale global relations scholar offers his 2 cents.
Politicians decide to express their concerns over what they call human rights, then there will be consequences for those actions.
Here is our host, Tian.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian in Beijing. U.S. President Joe Biden faced the nation in his first presidential media conference on Thursday. He fielded questions on the immigrant surge at the southern border, his COVID-19 relief package, efforts to vaccinate all Americans, and other concerns. The media conference came 64 days after he took office, way behind his 15 most recent predecessors, who all held a solo briefing within 33 days. In the past 2 months, Biden is reported to be focused on securing vaccines and passing his $1.9 trillion rescue package. But he's now faced with a surge in gun violence and racial hate crimes, as well as the new numbers of COVID-19. Abroad, senior officials are working hard from the U.S. to shore up ties with its traditional allies, labeling China, Russia as threats. So can Biden shake off Trump's legacy? To answer that question, let's loop in our panelists. A lot of discussion about international cooperation and China-U.S. relations. Let's listen in. For more on Biden's first presidential press conference, joining us in San Francisco, Bruce McConnell, President and CEO of the East-West Institute and also Distinguished Fellow from the Stimson Center. In Washington, D.C., Brian Becker, Executive Director of the Answer Coalition. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of CIIS, China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. Well, quite an occasion, the first presser by the President sitting in the White House. What is your general takeaway, Mr. McConnell?
3 things. I thought the president was clear and polite and determined, and I thought those were good traits for him to start out his first press conference with. He was primarily focused on domestic issues, getting over the pandemic, focusing on the economic recovery and creating jobs, and of course, immigration. In the foreign policy area, he told us that the number 1 concern is about North Korea, but of course there was a good exchange on China, which I'm sure we'll be discussing, but I thought he looked good.
All right. Mr. Becker?
The media was quite soft on Joe Biden compared to what Donald Trump press conferences looked like. I think that the media was strangely uninterested in COVID statistics. I mean, how could this be? Again, not a really hard-hitting press conference there. On China, I thought it was more of the same, sort of a follow-up with Anthony Blinken's bad performance in Alaska and Jake Sullivan's bad performance, very bad as hosts, treating their guests with such rancor. And I think it's clear that that this was not an anomaly, that Biden reiterated these points and said that China wants to lead the world and it won't happen on his watch, which maybe that's the real issue for America, not these other secondary issues that the United States really fears China's rise, which is unfortunate, I think.
We're going to go into some details, Mr. Becker, of some of the issues you just mentioned together with Mr. McConnell a bit later. Mr. Rong, what's your general takeaway?
I more or less, I think, agree with the 2 American colleagues. It seems that this is a quite well-managed press conference, and messages has been sort of sent out as planned. And of course, for the Chinese, very much, I think, listen carefully his President Biden's views about China. And I think what impressed me most is 2 things. One is that while he emphasized a lot about the competition, he made it very clear he does not want to see a confrontation between China, which I think can echo to the Chinese position in general. The other thing is, of course, I think I am very much impressed and amused to the extent that he tries best to combine its domestic agenda with the foreign policy issues. And I know this is the point. This is the message he would like to make. But I'm not sure. I would have our American colleagues' views how they have been made it well.
Very interesting. Different perspective certainly already here from the three of you, it seems that just a moment ago. Let me focus on some of the issues. First of all, the pandemic. That is the top priority. I'm very surprised that when the president was talking, not necessarily talking about the pandemic, but rather to say the vaccine. So, Mr. McConnell, how do you read this? Is he talking off the point?
Not at all. I think we're turning the corner on the pandemic here in America, and so.
What do you mean by turning the corner?
We...
Scientifically speaking, or politically speaking?
No, I think in terms of people are getting vaccinated, the vaccination rates are going up, death rates and hospitalizations are going down. So we're making progress, and I think people are ready in America to turn to other things while we continue to work, and it remains the number one priority domestically.
Mr. Becker?
I don't think that's quite accurate. I wish it were true, but the death rate actually has gone up in the last week for COVID, and there's new surges.
The long-term rate is going down.
Well, the rate went up by 2% yesterday. It went up 2% the day before. More than 1,000 died. When you think about 1,000 Americans dying each day, that doesn't seem like a lot anymore. But when you think about, say, what happened in Wuhan or Hubei or in China writ large, where you had less than 5,000 deaths and they didn't have forewarning, and you have Americans kind of being satisfied that we're turning the corner when we have 1,000 people dying each day, I just don't have the same sort of optimism. I think, yes, it's very good that so many people are getting vaccinated, and that is increasing, and that's a good sign.
Yeah.
But the healthcare system is a mess, and people are not accessing care properly. And even a great number of people don't want the vaccine because they're so skeptical about anything that the government says. So we have a very precarious situation with COVID-19 still.
All right, Mr. McConnell, of course, you need to respond to that.
I would just say that obviously we do things differently in America and in China, and that's one of the things the president talked about. And so, both systems have their pluses and minuses.
It's very interesting to talk about the system, and then I bring in Mr. Rong because some have seen it as a debate between different systems. The president was also trying to shape it that way, quote unquote, democracy versus quote unquote autocracy. And the president was also saying that the democracy needs to prove itself, it would work. That is pretty much looking at things with an ideological perspective. Now, is that related to the pandemic situation? Mr. Rong, looking from afar, what's your take?
How the government can work better in a sense that show the system is working. But I don't think it is, at least from Chinese perspective, would like to sort of present this competition as a kind of system. Rather, the Chinese is arguing that the system per se is because or formulated based on a kind of national conditions, level development, cultural things. In other words, China is happy with this system as long as it works. And China does not want to impose his system on others. And China would also wish the United States successful in managing the issues, in particularly, I think, the problems arising from the COVID-19 and economic, I think, growth and recovery.
It's very important everybody will be a winner in the fight against the COVID-19 because none of us will be safe until that happens. That's very true. It's not a political slogan. It's not diplomatic. It's just how science works. Having said that, though, let me move on to another issue about ideology. That is something that we cannot avoid listening to the first presser by the president. There seems to be an apparent priority rearrangement by this administration, putting what the administration believes at the human rights at the very top level. Even though some argue there might be problems with the U.S. human rights record and also human rights reality. The anti-Asian hate is one of those phenomena. Mr. McConnell, what is your take?
Well, I want to go back to the point that we have to find win-win solutions on this point. So yes, we have competition, and we have to cooperate also. We need co-opetition. So in this area, yes, there's different viewpoints, different ideologies, as you say. I'm surprised we are in an ideological discussion right now. I think there are many more practical problems that we could work together to solve and show leadership as the two greatest powers in the world, and that's what we should be focusing on.
Let me just bring back Mr. Roach, because China has been hesitating to talk about ideology, particularly when in a discussion with the U.S. When you hear what the president's answer is from the U.S. side about shaping it as a democracy versus autocracy, even though there might be debatable issues whether that categorization is correct or not. Mr. Roach, how do you see, the streamline of priorities by the current Biden administration from this press conference?
Biden more or less have the similar sort of priorities or issues on his agenda with Chinese and other leadership. For example, the people in the United States, as in those in China, they want to, at this moment, to have a normal life, so that to manage the impact, the fallout of a pandemic. They want to have a better life. Yes, the competition, but for the Chinese as concerned, we don't want to be sort of lectured that there's a system or there's a way to do, which they believe is much better, because the Chinese said this is the way we are doing, and it has so far it's been very successful. But we don't want to mess up your business. We don't want to interfere in your business. Just do what you rather do. Just do whatever you're supposed to do. I think that is more or less the feelings or sentiment of the Chinese, average Chinese, if I can say.
Mr. Becker.
Well, I think the tone, the lecturing tone of the United States adopts a position that the American system is a better system. You might frame it as ideology, but what the United States is essentially saying is that we are good. We are free people. And you, the Chinese, represent an authoritarian government, and you want to expand your authoritarianism so that other people don't enjoy the freedom that we enjoy and the freedom that we talk about to the other parts of the world. And I don't think this conforms to reality. I don't think the Chinese are trying to send their system anywhere else. I think the Chinese priority is to develop China, is to bring Chinese people out of poverty, to help China develop economically. And to do that, it needs to have economic trade with other countries. And it's offering economic terms for that trade, such as exists in the Belt and Road Initiative, which many countries consider to be favorable to them. So that is, in fact, in practice, a win-win. They develop, and China also has a way to gain resources and to access resources and to do trade. And the American government, as we can see in the presentation of this issue, framed as ideology, I don't think it's really purely ideology. I think they really fear that China is an advancing, new, rising economic power, and as such constitutes a real competition with a power that may be aging. And so the way it's framed is that this is good versus evil, when really it's the United States fearing that China's rise will somehow supplant the United States as the dominant economic power. And Joe Biden said as much when he said, China wants to be the leader of the world, but it won't happen on my watch. That has nothing to do with Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong or Taiwan. These are all issues that I think become pretexts for what the real issue is, which is the United States fears, and I don't think it should fear, but it does fear China's economic development.
One of the things that I've noticed from this press conference, the word cooperation has not been very much emphasized.
I think you're exactly right. What we need is these two countries to work together on things where they have a common interest, like public health and the pandemic, like climate change, like nuclear stability and denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. And those things provide an opportunity for these two great nations to show leadership while they're working out their differences. Everyone has differences, but we also need to work together. We have too little time on the planet. Things are happening too fast. We can't spend all our time fighting with each other.
Earlier, when Mr. Biden was serving as the vice president, when he was campaigning as a candidate, when he came into the office, the first, the speech that he gave, many of the messages is about cooperation. Many of the messages is about the U.S. needs to come back better. Better meaning does not mean that I'm getting better, not necessarily the others, right? Because you want to be a credible country in the world. So I don't know when the tone begins to change. Is it a change of tone, of words, or a change of heart and approach?
I think you're right. I mean, we need to lower the tone on both sides and try to avoid insulting each other. We can talk candidly in private, but in public, I think we should take a more cooperative approach. And we have a term we use in America, co-opetition. So on one day you compete with another company, and this day after that you cooperate with it. So that's the kind of relationship we need to have as mature adult countries.
In vaccines, for example, the former Secretary of State, Mr. Clinton, even spoke out, being with the same party with President Joe Biden, that U.S. should need to provide more vaccines to the other countries to even practice so-called vaccine diplomacy, whatever that means. But we haven't seen any of that, from this administration, except the promise of AstraZeneca vaccine to Canada. We don't know when that will be carried out, but not certainly to the developing and emerging economies. Today, we also learn from COVAX, the platform, that there's likely to be a delay of delivery to the COVAX platform vaccines to the emerging economies and developing countries because India manufacturers will not be able to provide certain crucial element of the product to produce those vaccines. So we're in a dire situation globally. How come this administration do not even talk about cooperation in terms of vaccines?
The need for cooperation is obvious, but the United States really has considered not only the Chinese handling of the healthcare crisis and the Chinese production of a vaccine, but also Russia and other countries that have been targeted in advance as major powers with which the United States is preparing for conflict. I mean, this is the operational doctrine of the United States, sadly, since 2018. And actually, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you prepare for major power conflict, if you budget, if you orient, if you plan contingencies, all designed to create a confrontation eventually with the other major power, then everything else falls in line with that. And then those who advocate for cooperation are considered soft on China or soft on Russia or failing to take China or Russia to task for human rights violations. So the atmosphere in America becomes very dark in a way. It becomes very difficult for people who know in their heart and in their mind that cooperation is greatly needed, right, that they're afraid to speak up because they don't want to be smeared as somehow being like an apologist for China. And this is the dangerous kind of Cold War atmosphere that exists not only between U.S. and China, but inside the United States. And we've been here before. The American people have been here before.
Both China and many others in the world need to hear a sound message about how this administration will shape the international relations and also the strategies to use for that, so that there will be issues that can cooperate, they can cooperate together right now, so that there will be deliverables in the future. So Mr. Roach, how do you see the current approach and the current stage of this administration forming its policies right now?
That's a great question. That's exactly, I think, we are missing from this press conference. It seems that, of course, naturally, the president's first press conference for around 2 months in the middle of the 100 days sort of office, it would like to showcase what has been doing and what is going to do, and defending or presenting the progress that have been made so far. And looking ahead that what will be continued. But the one thing is missing, which I think our two American colleagues made very clear, and also your question raised, that the tone and the readiness for the United States to reach out to the international community, to reach out to other countries, China, Russia, and others, to manage to address this problem. Not only for the world at large, of course, the United States is a major part, but for their own self-enlightened interest. And without that message, I think the United States is not going to have a good answer to that. And I understand that the society in the United States as a whole is very much divided, and the administration, Biden administration, is to some extent very much, I think, wary about that. But having the other talk about President Biden is going to be a transformational president. The presidency is going to be different.
Right.
This is the area. This is the time to show and then the presidency is different. And we're also impressed that he has, I don't know, officially or not announced he's going to run for the re-election. And these are the things I think which the international community is looking for. I think these are the things the American voters would like to have.
Mr. McConnell.
I think the bottom line of this is that you saw today the first press conference. We'll see more from President Biden. Obviously, domestic issues are the first priority, and we'll need to wait and see. They're in the middle of a China foreign policy review at the moment.
Yes.
So we'll see where they come out.
We did hear from the Secretary of Commerce, quote, U.S. is revising the strategy and to push back against China. That was the word being used. So many here are worried about what exactly it means.
I think it means, as the president said, that we're going to invest in technology and education and jobs and build ourselves, build back better, as he would say.
We understand, sometimes people need to create an enemy in order to do better and rally the morale back at home. But sometimes when you put a house on fire, it's very hard to extinguish it at the end of the day. Mr. Becker, I also want to have your final comment before we go.
I think the big issue for the United States in terms of global politics will be the China relationship. I think the United States has adopted this hostile position towards China without a real debate inside America.
Yes.
Suddenly, we had a new doctrine preparing the country for major power conflict. Suddenly, the media and the government issue only negative information about China. And public opinion in the United States, which was positive about China 10 years ago, has become negative. Why? Is this really the path that the United States wants to go on? And the fact that it's gone forward without a debate says to me that, though, like as you sort of suggested, we need an enemy. The Soviet Union's gone. Canada's not going to be much of an enemy. Mexico had a limited durability, but China's a rising power. And so you have the military-industrial complex, high-tech companies that are losing in international competition. Having an enemy is quite convenient. And sadly, this has changed the political atmosphere in America. And I don't think the American people will benefit from it. And certainly the people in China won't benefit from it. Okay. And certainly world peace won't benefit from it. And that's a sad day.
Brian Becker, Rong Ying, Bruce McConnell, always a pleasure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for contributing your insights from different perspectives. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, China-U.S. relations in a tailspin. What's going to happen to the trade and economic ties, and the latest discussion on the issue of cotton in the global supply chain with Stephen Roach coming up.
That would be a major setback to globalization.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Cutthroat competition or active cooperation? That's a question left hanging after the first meeting between Chinese and U.S. senior officials last week. For years, the U.S. has launched trade wars and human rights accusations against China. China on Thursday slammed some foreign companies, including H&M, for banning cotton from northwest China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, citing the so-called use of forced labor. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said the forced labor in Xinjiang is a complete lie and a smear campaign concocted by some anti-China organizations. After last week's fiery exchange in Anchorage, Alaska, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken met his NATO counterparts in Brussels on Tuesday, telling them the transatlantic security alliance should be, quote, focused on some of the challenges that China poses to the rule-based international order, end of quote. Can China-U.S. ties under Biden administration able to weather mistrust, or this is likely to go even worse? I talked to Stephen Roach, senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs and a senior lecturer at Yale School of Management. Let's listen in. Of course, the issue of cotton on the global supply chain is being discussed. As we see, the latest trade issue is concerning the cotton from Xinjiang. Now, it is great quality. As everybody knows, China is among the top 3 cotton producers in the world. The others are India and the United States. Now, with the so-called human rights issue, there has been companies, particularly international companies, many of them American and the Europeans, have to show their attitude toward the use of this cotton. Now, we all understand everybody's going to be hurt as a result. You know, the interests of these companies, global companies, the workers that are working in them, the market that they're having. The issue is who is going to be the winner. Mr. Roche, I've been looking at this issue and really wonder, are all the economic and trade issues now going to be hijacked by politics or politics-related issues?
You know, we have tended to focus a lot on economics and trade, and if there's one thing the Biden administration has done, and they underscored this at the meeting in Anchorage, was to change the priorities and really focus much more on these human rights allegations from Xinjiang to Hong Kong, and also express concerns over China's geopolitical issues in the South China Sea. So the message here is that the Biden administration is seemingly willing to shift the priorities, but there will be consequences for that, probably on the economic and trade issues, if that turns out to be the case.
I really wonder about whether this will be a single case or it is likely to set a precedence, whether it's between China and other trade partners or among other trading partners themselves, that politics will play a big role, that even a big word as hegemony will have a huge impact on how business is going to be conducted in the future, despite of the rules of business and the logic of business, Professor?
That's a great question. When politicians or global statesmen or leaders decide to express their concerns over what they call human rights or geopolitical issues by taking economic actions, then there will be consequences for those actions. And if they're willing to tolerate those consequences, which in the case of cotton means moving away from high quality, low cost Chinese cotton to other sources of cotton, which would be the functional equivalent of a tax increase on the consumers of cotton in the United States and elsewhere around the world. They, by shifting the focus, they are imposing a tax on their consumers. And so it does change the sense of priority in addressing economic issues vis-a-vis human rights. For a long time, we have placed the highest priority on economic issues, and if there's now a reprioritization going along, there will be economic consequences for that rethinking.
Earlier, we already had some lesson, isn't it? I mean, this administration coming into power claiming that the earlier administration using sanctions against China did not work. But now they're in the office and they're using, once again, politics into the issues of business and also economy. This, to me, doesn't make sense if you compare notes, earlier statements and what's going on right now.
Well, look, any economist, especially someone like me, I've been writing about this for years. The history of tariffs and sanctions has nothing but tragic precedents. Go back to the 1930s, you can see for yourself what a global trade war led to in terms of the Great Depression. We know that. We know that you should not be looking at trade through bilateral deficits. Any economist will tell you that it's a multilateral problem.
Yeah.
But the politicians, if they're inclined to reprioritize their focus, then they will have to face the consequences of how this will backfire through the trade relationships that are very important in supporting their respective economies.
One of the things is also about what's going to happen to the global supply chains and global manufacturing chains. Professor Cotton is only one of those examples, but it's one of the very important examples because it brings almost all different kinds of levels of economies together, developing country, emerging economies, developed economies. Their markets are very different, but together. So how do you see this interesting and sad example is likely to show us how the global supply chain is going to work? Is it going to be global supply chain for the United States and allies and global supply chains for China and other countries? To me, that is just ridiculous, but is it what's happening?
And while I understand your concern about cotton, because it is emblematic of this tension between non-economic and economic issues.
Right.
The real issue for supply chains involves sophisticated manufactured products like Apple iPhones, for example, that are assembled in China but reflect components from all over the world. And so if we begin to take apart these more complex supply chains that have taken, by the way, years, if not decades, to assemble, there could be major consequences in a wide range of products, from consumer electronics to automobiles and parts, to aircraft, to appliances. So I think we have to be very careful. I'm suspicious of this movement, what I've written about, called supply chain liberation, that we can just automatically bring the supply chains back to our home markets. The research shows that supply chains are pretty sticky. They take a lot of effort to develop and improve the quality of the assembly and the final product. So it's not that you can just push a button and change your sourcing from one country to another or back so easily to your home markets.
Meanwhile, as a result of this, the overall global trade system and also the ways of doing business will likely to change if that is the precedence we're seeing, for example, with this issue of cotton. So, Professor, what would that mean for global governance also?
Well, we have set up under the leadership of the United States, which it certainly it moved away from dramatically over the past 4 years. The World Trade Organization is a rules-based framework to govern the cross-border commerce around the world and to adjudicate disputes if and when they arise with an objective panel. The the Trump administration, of course, blocked the appointment of officials who were charged with adjudication, and there is a clear need for some reforms to be considered in terms of WTO governance. But it is the system that we have. It's a system that the United States and other nations, including China, have committed to, and it's the best system we have. And I think we need to renew our commitment to that as soon as possible.
The other thing is, what about international business? Global companies, they are operating, their lifeline is global supply chain and also a global operation. Now, if the cotton thing is a precedent, there's not only the issue of global supply chain being spoiled, but also how global companies will have to face politics on every issue, probably, from now on. So what would that mean for the fate of global companies, which is contributing tremendously, shall we say, to the global economy? Of course, they have their problems, but they're a great contributor of employment, of economic growth in various parts of the world.
Look, global multinational corporations certainly are now very much reliant on the efficiency solutions that are offered by global supply chains. The multinational corporation came into being because cost structures in home markets were prohibitively expensive in countries like the United States or Germany or even Japan. And so there was a growing recognition that we had the logistics, the technology, and the access to cheaper labor that was increasingly better educated to draw on the comparative advantage of these offshore platforms to drive new efficiencies and new profitability and jobs into multinational corporations around the world. So if you want to take that apart and end the efficiency solution of supply chains, it's a tax on multinational corporations and the workers they employ and the communities that those workers support. And that would be a major setback to globalization as we know it, which has been an important force in driving global prosperity.
Professor, you talked a lot about reasoning, logic, data, number, facts. But my question to you is, do they really matter anymore these days when politics seems to be the posturing also, seems to be the deciding factor for everything?
Well, that's a tough question. I write a lot, I speak a lot, I teach, teaching at Yale for now my 11th year, and my approach has always been data-based, analytical, and hopefully grounded in a deep appreciation of economic theory. But increasingly in my courses, I focus a lot on what we refer to as the political economy, the balancing act between politics and economics, and recognize that a lot of our economic analysis gets compromised by political decisions. Take for example the policy of the central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve. We like to think that our Federal Reserve is politically independent, which means that they are not have to deal with the pressures imposed by the Congress or the president. And yet, the Fed has become an important part of the political process that generates large budget deficits and addresses crisis after crisis with extraordinary unconventional monetary policies. And so, politics plays an increasingly important role in driving public policy, public economic policy, international policy, and then outcomes that affect domestic and the global economy. So your point is well taken.
At the just concluded press conference, the very first one Biden gave since he came into the office, he talked about China-U.S. relations did not necessarily in a rivalry light, and yet the word competition being mentioned a lot. He also shaped it with kind of ideology about so-called the democracy versus autocracy, whether you believe it or not. How do you see this approach by the current administration, at least during the first presser he has?
Well, I listened to those words pretty carefully, and his focus is more, at least in those remarks, were much more on the ideological conflict between two different systems than they were on trade and economic issues, which has been the area that most of us have focused on for a long, long time. And that's too bad, because I think on the trade and economic issue, there are real opportunities to do it differently, to move away from this phase one framework that Trump negotiated, and to move into a much more constructive engagement on some of these tough structural issues. And Biden at this point has shown really no inclination to abandon the approach that he was handed by President Trump, which is, I think, a mistake.
Stephen Roach, Senior Fellow at the Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, Senior Lecturer at Yale School of Management. What a pleasure, sir. My conversation with Stephen Roach on the latest issue of cotton in global supply chain, and also China-U.S. trade and economic ties. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching and